Standing on the steps of the city complex, I gave the parking lot a thorough once-over, making sure his truck was still parked where I'd last seen it. I knew he'd arrived just minutes ago, which gave me a solid 10 or 20 minutes before he'd likely be on his way again, but I couldn't help wanting to double-check. She'd only mentioned my trip when she called him, just a simple excuse to meet. Right about now, he was probably right there with her at the counter, talking and planning for the night, knowing I'd be out of town for 2 whole days, 2 days just for the two of them. No doubt, he'd stick around for that conversation. I'd be lying if I didn't admit I was both anxious and, oddly, a bit thrilled. I needed this to go smoothly. After all, I'd spent nearly 2 weeks mapping this out in detail. As I scanned the lot again, I spotted Harold's car pulling in. The rumbling exhaust from his old Camaro puffed out a trail of smoke as he parked. That car was a piece of junk to me, but Harold considered it a classic. Today, though, it was carrying some important cargo. I watched him clamber out, his movements a little clunky as he wrestled a beat-up briefcase out with him. After slamming the door twice to get it to stay closed, he strode over, grinning so widely that his white teeth gleamed against his flushed red face. That smile was all the encouragement I needed, and I grinned back. With a proud look, Harold lifted the briefcase and jogged up the steps to where I stood. Reaching me, he burst into laughter as he handed me a bundle of papers he'd pulled from inside. "It's all here, just like you wanted," he said. "Junior's right behind me with his copies, and the cops are following his lead. A few more minutes, and you'll have what you wanted." I took the papers, checked them over to make sure everything was in order, and then returned his smile. "Perfect. Junior's got official copies for both of them, just like we planned." "Everything set to go, Harold?" Harold gave me a firm nod but couldn't resist one last question. "Mark, are you absolutely sure about this? This is your chance if you want to back out." Without a second thought, I nodded. "I'm sure, Harold. I'm damn sure. Now, here's the part that matters. Linda Stone and I have been married for 16 years this month. We met back in high school, fell for each other pretty quickly, and stayed together on and off through our college years. I went off to Ohio State, and she headed to Mount Union near Youngstown. We both dated other people here and there while we were away, but it never failed that we'd end up back together whenever we came home for the holidays. In 1989, we both graduated and moved back to Toledo, the town we'd always known as home. Linda had her degree in accounting and landed a job with the city's auditor's office. Meanwhile, with my degree in civil engineering, I joined my dad's construction company, Holloway Construction. Dad focused mainly on big industrial projects, the kind that would keep him busy for years, so he never bothered with small jobs. He wanted me to learn the bidding process, the part of the business that had always made him successful. A bid too high meant losing the job, too low meant losing money. But a well-calculated bid? That was our golden ticket to securing jobs and building future opportunities. Working under him was like learning from a master. Linda and I were back to dating steadily, and as we settled into our careers, the idea of marriage came up naturally. We skirted around it for a while, but one sunny day in May, I finally popped the question. She said yes, and we set our sights on a September wedding. So, in 1991, we took our vows, promising to love and cherish each other for the rest of our lives. Our honeymoon in Hawaii was a full week of just us, and that's when I realized we shared an enthusiasm for intimacy that brought us even closer. To my pleasant surprise, Linda was eager to explore new dimensions of our relationship, and I was more than happy to join her on that adventure. We found joy in discovering each other, and those moments set a foundation for a vibrant, fulfilling life together. Coming back home, we transitioned into married life, nurturing the bond we'd begun to build. Love filled our days, and for a while, our life felt close to perfect. We'd agreed to wait before starting a family, choosing to get settled and enjoy each other for a bit. But 5 years into our marriage, during one of our intimate moments, I brought it up. "Do you want kids?" And if so, how many? I asked, watching her face as she considered the question. Linda looked at me with a tender smile, her eyes shining with affection. She had a calm confidence that made her even more captivating in that moment, her flushed cheeks and warm gaze making it unforgettable. When she finally moved close, she murmured, "That was incredible, Mark. I love you so much." Then she kissed me softly, her hands gently trailing along my side, and whispered, "Yes, I want kids. I think we should start soon." She had it all mapped out, with my job secure at my dad's company, and her steady stream of work assignments. She could work until she got pregnant, take a break for the baby, and then return once our child was old enough for daycare. "That's exactly what I was hoping for," I replied. "Though, tonight's out of the question since you're still on the pill. But in 2 weeks, we'll be good to go. Until then, I suppose we'll just keep practicing." She laughed, leaning in to say she was worn out and only wanted to fall asleep in my arms. True to her word, Linda stopped taking her pills, and from there, we started the journey to parenthood. About 5 months later, our excitement skyrocketed when we found out she was pregnant. We decided on the name Walker, after Max's mom, followed by my own mother's name. Linda was meticulous about taking care of herself and the baby, and when Walker finally arrived, everything felt right. Linda became an incredible mother, balancing her care for Walker with her love and attention for me, and life honestly felt like a dream. As Walker grew, we looked into daycare for when she turned 3. Max discovered a fantastic place that we both checked out and felt great about. Soon after, Walker started there, and Linda returned to work. Then, when Walker was 4, we decided to try for another child. Our intimate life had regained its rhythm, and while I hesitated to disrupt it, we agreed the timing was right. We practiced frequently until Linda announced she was expecting again, and I was thrilled. Those last months before the pregnancy discomfort set in were some of the best, filled with closeness and new discoveries. When we found out we'd be having a boy, it felt like everything had come full circle. We'd wanted a boy and a girl, and now that was about to become real. We named him Jake Thomas, honoring both of our fathers, and when he arrived healthy and happy, we felt a sense of completeness we'd never known before. Life was everything we could have wished for. As Jake grew, Linda stayed home to look after both kids. When Jake reached 2.5, she felt ready to return to work, and I supported her every step of the way. I fully supported Linda's choice to go back to work, and she started making preparations to return. Right around that time, however, our almost perfect life hit a small snag with the arrival of new neighbors, Paul and Melissa Walker. Linda and Melissa quickly became close friends, often spending time together, though Paul and I never really clicked in the same way. Despite that, Melissa became a regular visitor at our home, and even though I didn't have anything specific to pin it on, I couldn't shake a feeling of distrust toward her. Linda settled back into her job at the city complex, specifically in the building permit department, which meant I'd often run into her whenever I went in for permits or other work-related tasks. Our lives returned to a familiar rhythm, and our love life felt as fulfilling as ever. When our 15th wedding anniversary rolled around, things seemed to be on track. Behind the scenes, however, things began to unravel when Melissa suggested that Linda and I throw a party to introduce her and Paul to our friends. I figured it wasn't a bad idea, so I agreed to invite a few of my construction buddies, and Melissa took care of a guest list of her own. We planned a Saturday afternoon barbecue, sent the kids off to stay with Grandma and Grandpa, and geared up for a good time. The party kicked off nicely. I introduced Paul and Melissa to some of my friends and took time to include Linda, as she hadn't met a lot of the people there. Everything was going smoothly until I caught sight of Dan Keller, a trucking contractor I sometimes worked with. I hadn't invited Dan, so his appearance was unexpected. To be honest, Dan wasn't my favorite person. Known for playing fast and loose with the law and his way with women, single or married, he didn't exactly have a shining reputation. I watched him schmooze with some of the ladies and figured he was probably collecting phone numbers. Then, a little while later, Linda came over to me with a curious look and asked, "Who's the guy in the leather jacket and tight jeans? He's got that rugged look." "That's Dan Keller," I said, keeping my tone casual. "Stay away from him. He's notorious for chasing after women, married or not. Real piece of work, that guy." "Then why'd you invite him if you don't even like him?" she asked, giving me a skeptical glance. "Well, I didn't invite him. Connie must have brought him along," I explained, noticing she still seemed intrigued. I tried to head back to the grill, but she stopped me and insisted, "Introduce Melissa and me. I want to see what's so interesting about this guy." Before I knew it, she was tugging me toward Melissa, and together they made a beeline for Dan, practically dragging me along with them. As we reached him, Dan greeted me with a sly grin. "Hey, Mark. Heard you were having a get-together. Connie invited me along, hope you don't mind." He glanced between Linda and Melissa, his smile widening in a way that sparked irritation in me, though I held it back. "Sure, Dan, no problem," I replied, making the introductions. "This is my wife, Linda, and her friend Melissa from next door. Ladies, meet Dan Keller." I left them to their conversation and headed back to the grill, keeping one eye on them as I continued cooking burgers and hot dogs. Paul was busy manning the drinks, and as the afternoon rolled on, I eventually stopped keeping tabs on Dan and the ladies, getting lost in conversations with friends instead. About an hour later, Linda came over to help me with the food, though I noticed her glancing toward Dan from time to time. I didn't think much of it. As the party wound down and guests began heading home, I noticed Linda standing off to the side, deep in conversation with Dan. They were close, leaning in toward each other, and it made me uncomfortable. I called over to Linda, asking her to give me a hand, and she looked at me, then took a step back from Dan. She said something to him before walking over. I got distracted for a minute saying goodbye to another couple, and when I turned back, I saw that Dan had left, and Linda was talking quietly with Melissa. The rest of the party wrapped up without a hitch, and Paul and Melissa helped us tidy up afterward. Linda seemed unusually quiet that evening, focused on cleaning up the leftover food, washing dishes, and tossing out paper plates and cups. I eased into my chair to relax, watching her as she worked silently around the kitchen. My feet were aching after a full day of standing at the grill, and I must have drifted off almost immediately once I hit the chair. I don't remember much until Linda gently woke me up later, urging me to come to bed. Groggy but content, I followed her, figuring she'd be just as worn out and ready to sleep as I was. But, it turned out I was mistaken. As soon as the lights were out, Linda became unexpectedly assertive, initiating intimacy without a moment's hesitation. She was eager, and things heated up fast, catching me completely off guard. Her intensity was surprising, and though she was always passionate, there was something different this time. She seemed already aroused before we even made it to bed, and I couldn't quite place what had brought this on. Afterward, as we lay there in the quiet, I turned to her and asked, "Linda, what was that all about? Where did that come from?" She looked at me, her cheeks flushed with what I thought was embarrassment. Instead of answering, she slid away, turned her back, and sat on the edge of the bed. I was startled to see her shoulders shaking with silent tears. Reaching out to comfort her, I barely touched her arm before she stood and moved away, retreating into the bathroom and shutting the door behind her. Confused and unsure of what to do, I decided not to press her and simply rolled over, trying to get some sleep. The next morning, I woke to the sounds of Leaf and Walker playing downstairs. I glanced at the clock, it was nearly 10 a.m., and I'd slept straight through. Shaking off my grogginess, I showered and tried to push away the strange tension from the night before. About half an hour later, I headed downstairs and found Linda and Melissa sitting quietly at the kitchen table. When I walked in, Linda stood and grabbed a cup to pour me some coffee. I sat down, noticing how Melissa watched me in silence. Usually, I'd brush it off, but today it felt unsettling. Linda set the coffee in front of me and exchanged a glance with Melissa, who then rose and left the room. Once Melissa was gone, Linda sighed and broke the silence. "I'm sorry about last night," she began. "You must have thought I'd lost my mind. It was a mistake." She sat down across from me, looking like she genuinely regretted the whole thing. "What do you mean, a mistake?" I asked, hoping the coffee would clear up my confusion a bit. Linda explained, "Chris and some of the girls and I were just joking around, talking about our husbands and a bunch of other stuff. I got a bit carried away, and, well, I acted impulsively when we went to bed. I didn't stop to think about you, and I'm sorry." She seemed genuinely embarrassed, admitting that she'd felt so overwhelmed that she'd gone to the bathroom to calm down. When she came back, I was already asleep, so she'd decided to let it go. I thought it over and decided there was no point in dragging it out if she wanted to move past it. "It's all right, Linda." I was exhausted. "To be honest, I probably wouldn't have had the energy to really enjoy it anyway," I said, hoping to lighten the mood a bit. She looked relieved and said with a soft smile, "Good. I'll make it up to you tonight. You can count on that." With her reassurance, things seemed to smooth over, and we moved on. But about a week later, Linda asked if I'd mind if she went out with Melissa for some drinks and conversation. She said they wanted to invite a few other women Melissa knew to expand their social circle a bit. She mentioned they'd only be out for a couple of hours and asked if I could look after the kids, which I agreed to without much thought. I didn't realize it then, but that night would mark the start of some noticeable shifts in our usual routine. "Sure, honey, it's probably good for you to make some new friends," I told her. "I'll keep the kids entertained while you're out having fun." Linda smiled at my response, though her excitement seemed a bit reserved, as if she wasn't sure how I'd react. On Thursday evening, Linda dressed simply in slacks, a blouse, and a sweater jacket. We were chatting in the kitchen when Melissa arrived and knocked on the door. Linda said her goodbyes to the kids and me before heading out for the evening. What began as an occasional night out with Melissa and her friends gradually became a regular event. At first, it was once or twice a month, but soon it turned into a weekly routine. I took over looking after the kids on those nights, finding joy in our little outings to places like indoor play zones, the zoo, and Chuck E. Cheese. Spending more time with them brought us closer, and I came to cherish those moments. However, I couldn't ignore the changes in my relationship with Linda. Early on, she'd come home eager to reconnect, but as time went on, our intimacy became less frequent, and she seemed increasingly distant. Linda also grew more reserved, showing little interest in exploring new things in bed. When I tried to talk with her about it, she became defensive and frustrated, which only heightened my sense that something wasn't right. Wanting to understand what was going on, I began discreetly listening in on her phone calls with Melissa, but Linda caught on quickly and altered her behavior, making it tough to gather any real information. Determined to get to the bottom of things, I went to Radio Shack for some advice on discreetly monitoring phone calls. After spinning a story about needing to monitor my daughter's phone usage, the store clerk suggested some equipment that could do the job. I purchased it and set up the system at home while Linda was at work. I located the main phone line running from the garage, feeling a mix of anxiety and determination as I prepared to splice it. Following the young clerk's instructions, I cut the line and connected it to the small panel on the back of the recorder. Working with the tiny wires was tricky, but after some effort, I managed to get it all hooked up. I placed the recorder behind a shelf loaded with old magazines, an ideal hiding spot since that area hadn't been touched in years. The device was designed to capture all conversations onto a memory stick, holding up to 5 hours of audio. Programmed to activate only when sound was detected, I'd be able to review the recordings on any computer with a USB port. After finishing the setup, I went back to work, checking the memory stick periodically. Unfortunately, all it captured was routine chatter with Melissa. I started to suspect that Linda was being overly cautious. To give her a chance to speak more freely, I decided to make myself noticeably absent that evening. After dinner, I told Linda I was taking the kids to the indoor gym to let them burn off some energy. She declined, citing house chores, so I took the kids out, enjoying the outing with them. We stayed out for a good 2.5 hours, returning home with the kids completely worn out and ready for bed. When I came back downstairs, Linda was sitting in the den, watching TV. I decided to wait until she went to bed before checking the recordings. Lately, she'd been heading to bed earlier than usual, as if hoping I'd already be asleep, which gave me the impression she was trying to avoid any intimate moments. I sat down in the home office, answering emails and working, waiting for her to retire for the night. When she finally came to say goodnight, I gave her a quick acknowledgement, pretending to stay focused on my work. Once she went upstairs, I retrieved the recorder from the garage, turned it off, and took out the memory stick. I inserted the memory stick into the computer's USB slot and opened the files, eager to see if anything revealing had been recorded. To my surprise, I discovered a conversation between Linda and Melissa. They talked about their time spent together, including some other friends, and shared details about their nights out and interactions with different people. As I listened, it became clear that they'd been involved in activities that left Linda feeling uneasy. There was talk of adding more nights out and mention of past experiences that were more revealing than I'd expected. The tone in Linda's voice was enough to tell me that these outings weren't as innocent as I'd thought, and they were clearly having an impact on her. Linda's hesitation and nervous mannerisms told me she was conflicted about everything going on. After I copied the file onto my hard drive and erased the memory stick for future use, I put the recorder back where it belonged. As I headed to bed, that conversation kept replaying in my mind, stirring up an uneasy mix of frustration and doubt. I had a gut feeling about what was happening, but without solid proof, I needed to gather more evidence to fully understand the extent of it all. Linda was already in bed, feigning sleep, though I could feel her tension. Her breathing quickened when I turned toward her, but I simply lay down and closed my eyes. Gradually, she seemed to relax as I made no further moves, and eventually, sleep took over as my mind buzzed with troubled thoughts. The next morning, I browsed the yellow pages and found an ad for a private investigator. I called to set up an appointment for later that afternoon. After wrapping up some pending work and finishing a bid that was due, I decided to hold off discussing it with my colleagues until the next day. I drove to a rough part of town and found the building listed in the address. It had seen better days, but I was focused on the reason I was there, not the building's condition. I made my way up to the second floor and saw an empty desk where a secretary might usually sit. Instead, a small sign pointed toward a door at the back. I walked over and knocked. "Come on in, it's open," a deep voice called from inside. Stepping into the room, I found myself facing a large man, easily over 300 pounds, who seemed to fill the small space. Despite his imposing size, he greeted me with a warm smile that put me at ease. I introduced myself and offered a handshake, which he took with a firm grip. "You must be Mr. Pattern," he said, nodding. "I'm Harold Bowen, and I run this place. Go ahead and sit." "As you can see, I sit a lot myself," he chuckled. "Please, call me Mark," I replied, grateful for the prompt meeting. "Thanks for seeing me so soon. I could use your help." I laid out my concerns and suspicions, explaining that I needed proof of my wife's activities. I gave him the relevant details, including Melissa and Paul's names and addresses, and mentioned Dan Keller as a possible key player. Harold listened intently, his gaze steady, giving me the odd feeling of both anxiety and cautious optimism. "So, do you think you can help me figure out what's going on?" I asked, eager for a straightforward answer. "It sounds manageable," he replied, leaning back. "But I have one question. What about this Keller guy? Are you looking to catch him with your wife?" "Yes," I said. "Dan Keller's got a questionable reputation, and I want as much information on him as possible." "Fair enough," he replied. "Here's the deal, I can handle just about anything you need, but it'll cost you." Would you prefer to pay by the day or settle on a flat rate for the whole job? The latter's more economical in the long run. I can investigate your wife, Keller, and anyone else involved for a one-time fee of $5,000, or I charge $300 a day plus expenses. Your call. The amount caught me off guard, but it didn't take long to decide this was worth the price. I opted for the full payment and let him know. He didn't seem to mind either option but mentioned he'd need a retainer to get started. I wrote him a check for $2,500, which he glanced at before tucking away. Here's how it'll go, he continued. Give me all the details you have, and I'll take it from there. I'll need access to your home to set up some equipment, so you'll need to create a reason for me to check out your bedrooms and garage. Think you can manage that? That shouldn't be an issue, I replied, nodding. I've actually been thinking about installing an alarm system, so you could use that as a cover. How does that sound? Perfect, he agreed, smiling. Let's get started with the information you've got. I left the office feeling a renewed sense of confidence, ready to take the next steps toward uncovering the truth. On my drive home, I couldn't shake Mark's final words. He had asked if I was truly prepared to go through with this, warning that uncovering the truth might cost me my marriage. He'd even suggested that I talk things out with Linda and try to settle matters before committing to his investigation. But I'd reassured him that I was ready to get the answers I needed, whatever the outcome. Arriving home a little earlier than usual, I decided to enter through the back door rather than my usual side entrance. As I stepped in, I noticed Melissa sitting at her kitchen table, deep in conversation with Linda. Neither of them had spotted me, so I moved as quietly as possible into the hallway near the kitchen and listened carefully, my mind still set on uncovering the truth after my visit with Bowen. The conversation I overheard revealed more than I could have imagined. Come on, Linda, Melissa was saying. You know he doesn't suspect anything. He just thinks we're out with the girls for drinks. She sounded amused. Paul doesn't know a thing either, but he wouldn't care even if he did, so relax. Linda's voice was softer, laced with worry. I can't help it. I feel like Mark senses something's different. It's partly my fault, I haven't been as affectionate, and things have changed between us. I still care about being close to him, but he seems different now, and it scares me. It's all in your head, Linda. Mark trusts you completely. You know that, Melissa assured her. Yeah, and I'm betraying that trust, Linda replied, her voice pained. I love Mark so much. If he found out, I don't know what I'd do. This has to end. Melissa chuckled softly. But if you do end it, you'll never be happy again. He'll never accept what you're doing with Dan and Joe, and I know you'll miss it. Linda let out a weak laugh. What, invite you over for a threesome with Mark? To make things even? That would kill me. I couldn't stand seeing him with anyone else. I'm such a hypocrite, but I need to stop this. Dan won't let you, Melissa warned. He's got those pictures from the first time. If you back out, he'll show Mark. You're better off going along with it until Dan loses interest. Yeah, I guess, Linda murmured, sounding resigned. It's not exactly torture, anyway. I don't know why, but I can't just walk away from Dan. They both laughed, and I felt a sick churn in my stomach. I quietly slipped back to the back door, then made my usual entrance through the side, deliberately making enough noise to announce my arrival. As Melissa passed me on her way out, she gave me a friendly pat on the shoulder, which I returned with a tense nod, barely managing to keep my frustration in check before turning back to Linda. Where are the kids? I asked, noting the house was quiet. They're with your mom. She wanted to take them out to buy new jeans. She's always spoiling them, Linda replied, her back turned as she busied herself at the sink, scrubbing dishes a little too diligently. I wasn't up for further conversation, so I replied, Mom's got a lot of time on her hands since Dad passed. You know how she is. I headed upstairs to change, feeling a wave of anger surge through me. Once in the bathroom, I locked the door, turned on the sink, and sat down, letting myself go. The day had been too much, meeting with Harold, overhearing Linda's conversation with Melissa, and seeing her avoid even looking at me. All of it piled up, and I broke down, crying harder than I had since I was a kid. When I finally calmed down, my face was wet and raw, and I took a moment to wash up and pull myself together. When I went back downstairs, my mom had returned with the kids, and they were eager to show me their new things. Walker twirled in her new skirt, beaming, while Jake proudly displayed a pair of tennis shoes with a signature on them, making them far more expensive than they should have been. I made the usual appreciative comments, pulled Mom aside to thank her for being so generous, and lightly chided her for spoiling the kids with so much. My mom invited us over for a barbecue that weekend, and I told her I'd check with Linda and get back to her. For the rest of the evening, I kept my distance from Linda, choosing instead to play with Jake and Walker. They were busy with their toys, excited to have me join in, and we kept at it until bedtime. As usual, there was some playful protest, but Linda was firm about bedtime, and off they went. I sank into my chair, turning on the TV, though I couldn't tell you what was on. I was just staring blankly at the screen, lost in thought. Eventually, Linda walked in, let out a small huff at the show, and changed the channel. She settled in beside me, watching whatever was on, while I quietly watched her out of the corner of my eye, searching for changes that must have been there. She looked like the same woman I'd been married to for over 15 years, but her behavior was different, more withdrawn, moody, and barely meeting my gaze for more than a moment. She was short with her words, quieter, and no longer showed the same enthusiasm in bed. Where she once took the lead, she now barely showed interest, leaving me to initiate, and I was exhausted from always being the one to make the first move. But staring at her now, none of these changes showed. Her eyes avoided mine, and she seemed somewhere far away. By 11, the weight of exhaustion hit me, but more than anything, I longed for the escape that sleep might bring. I told her I was calling it a night and went upstairs. After a long shower to wash away the feeling of betrayal, I crawled into bed, worn down and filled with sadness. I closed my eyes, offering a prayer that somehow this nightmare might fade, praying with every ounce of hope I had left, but no relief came. I felt tears press at the corners of my eyes, but I held them back. Enough. I was almost asleep when I felt Linda climb into bed beside me. I kept my breathing steady, feigning sleep, forcing myself not to tense as she nestled against me, her arm resting over my hip. Her breath warmed my shoulder, but I resisted any urge to react. She whispered my name, but I kept up the pretense, breathing calmly. She shifted, pressing closer, hoping to stir a response. I started counting by twos in my mind, trying to stay completely still. After a while, she seemed to give up, rolling onto her back in silence. Just as I was drifting off again, I heard her soft, quiet sobs. Once, those sounds would have jolted me awake, pushing me to comfort her, but tonight, all I felt was a deep, chilling emptiness. The next morning, I casually mentioned to Linda that someone was coming by to give us an estimate on a security system we'd been discussing for a while. She nodded, fine with the idea, and I went ahead and called Harold, telling him to come over that afternoon. He said he'd be there shortly after lunch, and I assured Linda I'd come home to let him in so she wouldn't need to leave work. All I wanted now was for Harold to install whatever he needed. The waiting and the suspicion were eating me alive, and all I had so far were unsettling conversations between her and Melissa. The next few nights played out much like the first. I pulled away from Linda's attempts to reconnect, claiming I was too worn out from work. Since my dad's passing, I'd taken over the whole company, though I'd trained capable people to handle the major tasks, freeing up more of my time than ever before. But instead of sharing that with her, I buried myself in work to avoid spending time at home. I'd either go to bed early and pretend to be asleep when she came up, or I'd wait until she drifted off and quietly slip into bed or stay downstairs on the couch. My life felt like a waking nightmare, a hell I couldn't escape. But I needed the truth, no matter what it cost. Harold called me that Friday to let me know his equipment hadn't picked up anything yet. He suggested I plan a trip out of town, at least 3 days and nights, to give her more freedom. I agreed, and after making the necessary arrangements, I returned home that Monday night. Once the kids were in bed, I approached Linda. "Linda, I've got something to tell you," I began. "I'll be heading out of town for a few days to meet with some clients about a potential project. It's a big one and could keep the business running for nearly a year. I'll fly out tomorrow evening and should be back by Friday. Just 3 nights." Her reaction caught me off guard. She looked genuinely angry, her gaze finally meeting mine directly. I could see her processing her response, and the irony of her justified anger almost made me laugh, but I held back. "Well, it's nice of you to give me a day's notice," she replied coldly. "What am I supposed to do with Tiff and Jake? Did that cross your mind?" I didn't hold back this time. "Look, I've been taking care of them every Thursday night so you can stay out late with your friends, long after the kids are asleep. I put in a full day at work and then come home to handle things while you're out. But I haven't seen you return the favor, have I? When have I ever asked you to do the same for me?" Her expression shifted, and the realization of her words seemed to hit her. A flush crept over her face, and she turned away, speechless. "You're right," she admitted quietly, her tone softened. "I guess I haven't been fair. I'm sorry. I'll be fine while you're away. It's important, I know you wouldn't go if it wasn't. I'll get your mom to help with the kids. She'll love it." "Good. I'm glad we're on the same page," I replied, adding with a hint of sarcasm, "I'll be packing tonight, so I'll head out straight from work tomorrow." I was worried that my tone might spark a fight, but Linda seemed too preoccupied to notice. That night was the hardest yet. She wanted to be close, initiating intimacy, but I couldn't bring myself to go through with it. I pleaded exhaustion and explained I needed to focus on the job decision, telling her I'd be back to my usual self once it was all settled. She took it hard, and when she thought I'd fallen asleep, I heard her crying softly beside me. Her tears, which once would have torn at my heart, left me numb. I made up my mind that if I returned and Harold found no evidence of wrongdoing, I'd stop all of this and try to win my wife back. But if he found something, well, I didn't let myself think that far. The next day, I followed the plan, checking into a hotel about 50 miles away, where I'd stay for the next 3 days. I called Linda on my cell a few times each day, especially on Thursday, when she'd usually be out with Melissa. Oddly, I kept reaching her voicemail, with no sign of her picking up. I left her a message saying, "You must be busy if you can't take my call." I knew it sounded bitter, but my anger was hard to suppress. Harold had instructed me not to call him, he'd reach out to me when there was news. So, I waited, using the downtime to work on a few important estimates. Time felt like it dragged. When Harold finally called, it was the day before I was supposed to fly back. He asked me to come to his office as soon as possible. I packed up, checked out of the hotel, and drove the 50 miles back, not realizing then how much I'd regret it. Sitting in Harold's office, I felt my stomach sink as he pulled out a stack of photos. There was Linda, with Dan Keller and another man I didn't recognize. The images showed me exactly what she was doing, and who she was doing it with, leaving me in shock and reeling from the reality of it all. The truth I'd been searching for was finally mine, but it was worse than I'd ever imagined. The photos showed her with each of them, and in several shots, Melissa was there too. I saw things that I'd only ever dreamed of, things I had never shared with Linda. The images turned my stomach, filling me with a sickening blend of anger and betrayal. Without a word, I bolted to the bathroom, barely making it to the sink before losing whatever was left of my composure. Harold didn't say a thing, just listened to me retch as he sat at his desk. When I staggered back, my face pale and still in shock, he stood momentarily, then took his seat again, waiting for me to gather myself. Finally, I found the strength to ask the question gnawing at my mind. Where were my kids? I know these photos were taken in my bedroom. Where were Walker and Jake? My voice was shaky, a part of me fearing the answer. With your mother, Harold replied calmly. They weren't there, Mark. Rest easy on that. The tension in my chest loosened just slightly. When did this happen? Thursday night. And what about the other nights? I asked, needing to know if this had happened before. No, this was the only time she brought them to your house, he replied. It was the second night you were away. I heard one of them mention that he'd never been allowed there before and how pleased he was to finally be involved. That was Dan Keller. He's quite the piece of work. My anger flared up again. I want something done about him. I know adultery isn't a crime, but there has to be a way to deal with him. Harold's face grew thoughtful. I know some people who could handle it. It'll cost you an extra $2,000. Can you manage that? I didn't hesitate. Money's not an issue. Just get it done. Give me a week, he replied. Talk to your lawyer, get him ready to serve her the papers in 1 week. I'll handle the rest. I'll need the cash, small bills, so I can buy what I need. Mark, you'll have to trust me. Can you do that? Harold, I trust you more than the woman I thought I knew, the mother of my kids, I said, the realization still cutting deep. I ended up staying with Harold that night, and the two of us emptied a bottle of Johnny Walker whiskey together. The next morning, I woke up on the floor of his small, one-room apartment. Harold was snoring on a Murphy bed nearby. I pulled myself up, washed up as best I could, and roused him long enough for him to tell me that my car was downstairs. I drove to the office, managed to put in a few hours, and then headed home, looking rumpled enough to convince Linda I'd been on an early flight home after a morning meeting with clients. Harold had urged me to spend the next week acting as if nothing was wrong, treating Linda normally to avoid raising suspicion. She couldn't know I was onto her, or she might tip off Dan, ruining the whole plan. I hated the idea, but I decided to use the time to recall how things were before all of this, before everything fell apart. The hardest part was that I still loved her, even though she'd betrayed me. That love was something that would die slowly, but for now, it clung on, a cruel reminder of what once was. That first night back was brutal. I spent time with the kids, helped them get ready for bed, and then sat down with Linda to talk about the job. Eventually, we went up to bed together, and for the first time in 3 weeks, I was intimate with her. I'd stayed faithful throughout our marriage, and though I didn't carry any guilt, each touch and kiss felt like it was tearing me apart. She responded eagerly, her body fully surrendering to the closeness. In the back of my mind, I worried about STDs and even AIDS, but somehow, in that moment, none of it mattered. Afterward, I lay there feeling like I was mourning the death of my marriage, the end of a life I thought was secure. As the days passed, I found myself thinking more and more about a future without Linda, a life where she was no longer part of it. And then there were Walker and Jake. What would they think when they realized their parents were separating? How would we arrange visitation? Who would they stay with? The questions weighed heavily on me, each one a reminder of the life that had slipped through my fingers. When Linda brought 2 men and another woman into our home, the decision became crystal clear. I'd go for full custody, using the photos Harold had as leverage. While I accepted the end of my marriage, it weighed heavily on me, bringing waves of sadness. I'd often find myself tearing up without reason during the day and at night. My patience was thin at work, snapping over small things, and each evening, I dreaded going home. Gradually, I spent longer hours at the office, often returning after dinner. Linda noticed my absences, but between my strange behavior and the renewed attention in the bedroom, she seemed unsure of what to think. Behind the scenes, I'd been working with my lawyer to finalize the divorce terms, determined to make sure the kids wouldn't bear the brunt of it. I planned for college funds, medical coverage, and every essential detail to keep their lives as stable as possible. Originally, I'd hoped Linda and I could work together for their sake, but now I faced joint decision-making, managing our shared bank accounts, and allocating our savings. We weren't wealthy, so those accounts were modest, but I was resolute that she'd have no claim on my 401k or my investments. Her betrayal forfeited any right to my future. While I knew alimony would be part of the equation, I intended to make it as minimal as possible. There was no way I'd reward her infidelity by funding her lifestyle indefinitely. She could earn her own money. I even considered jokingly that she and Melissa could go into business together, they'd likely do well. Then there was the question of whether to tell Paul about Melissa. I felt he deserved to know what was going on. I brought it up with Harold, who suggested an anonymous envelope sent to Paul's workplace. I liked the idea and asked Harold to make the arrangements. He said he'd handle it and advised waiting until the following Monday for it to play out. That week, Linda and I were intimate 3 times. Curiously, she didn't go out for her regular night with Melissa, so I checked with Harold. He confirmed that she'd met with Dan twice that week at lunchtime, even going to a motel on Tuesday. That night, she had claimed to have a headache, which explained her lack of interest. On Thursday, we were intimate again, but I realized that no matter what she did, Linda would likely never be faithful. She'd built a life on deception, and I decided she could continue down that road, just without me. On Sunday night, as we lay in bed, I told her I had a business trip to Chicago the next day. It would be quick, just an overnight trip. She made a small fuss but eventually accepted it, and that night we made love for what I knew would be the last time. I put my all into it, knowing this would be our final moment together. Linda seemed to relish each moment, unaware that it was our farewell. Monday came, and I was stationed outside the city complex where Linda worked, along with Harold, Jr., and the sheriff. I'd arranged for the kids to stay with my mother and spent an hour explaining my plan, showing her one photo to convince her. Linda's parents were dealing with their own health issues and lived too far away, so they'd only find out if she decided to tell them. At that moment, the envelope meant for Paul was being delivered to his workplace, while Melissa was likely at home, oblivious. Junior gave a nod as he arrived with the sheriff, indicating it was time. He carried 2 envelopes and went ahead, knowing precisely where to go. I followed discreetly down the hall as Junior turned into a small office marked, "Building Permits," ready to see it all unfold. As I watched from my hidden spot, I saw Dan Keller leaning against the counter, chatting casually with one of the women behind it. Junior walked up to Linda, confirmed her identity, and handed her an envelope. She looked puzzled but took it without much question. Then Junior turned to Dan and asked if he was, indeed, Dan Keller. Dan nodded, looking slightly confused. Junior pushed the other envelope toward him and said, "You've been served." With that, he quickly walked away, giving me a subtle nod as he passed. From my concealed position, I focused on Linda's reaction. She opened the envelope, pulling out the documents, and skimmed the first page. As her eyes reached the photo attached with a paperclip, her face went deathly pale. Her hands began to tremble, her mouth moving in a silent, anguished cry. She collapsed forward onto the counter, the envelope and its contents scattering across the floor. Tears started streaming down her face, and she struggled to scream, finally finding her voice and letting out a heart-wrenching "no" that echoed through the quiet office. She slowly sank down behind the counter, visibly shattered. Dan, meanwhile, had also looked through his document, which named him in a lawsuit, including a picture and a restraining order. It claimed a stake in his business and prohibited him from contacting Linda, visiting my home, or approaching my workplace. Linda found a similar restraining order in her documents, barring her from our home and children until a visitation schedule could be arranged. Dan's face darkened, his expression twisted in anger. He shoved the papers back into the envelope, storming out of the building. I stayed hidden, waiting until he passed, then followed him at a safe distance as he exited through the front doors, right into the path of the sheriff. From my vantage point at the open door, I heard the sheriff's voice ring out clearly, "Dan Keller, you are under arrest for grand theft." Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. If you can't afford one, one will be appointed for you. Do you understand these rights? Dan resisted, but he eventually mumbled his acknowledgement. The sheriff and his deputy led him to the patrol car, where he banged his head against the doorframe as they guided him in, prompting a deputy to mutter a half-hearted apology. Later, Harold explained that Dan had been linked to a string of thefts from local shops and that all the stolen goods had been found in one of his trucks. Everything would be returned to the rightful owners, thanks to a warrant executed by the sheriff based on a tip from one of Harold's contacts. With that matter handled, I walked back inside and headed down the hall toward Linda's section. I spotted a small group of women gathered around a chair and figured Linda must be sitting there. I pushed through gently, finally seeing her, head down, shoulders slumped in utter defeat. It was a sight that filled me with a mix of sorrow and grim satisfaction, one I wished no one ever had to witness. In a steady, cold voice, pushing down any emotions that threatened to surface, I said, "Don't come home tonight. The restraining order in your papers bars you from coming anywhere near me, the kids, or the house until the court changes the terms. Let me know where to send your things." Linda looked up at me, her face ghostly pale, her eyes red and swollen, and her lips trembling. In that moment, I realized I still loved her as much as ever, yet I was disgusted by the sight of her. She absorbed my words, and with a voice frayed and barely holding together, she whispered, "I'm so sorry, Mark. I love you more than my own life. I'm so very sorry." I looked at her, feeling numb, hollowed out by the weight of carrying through with what I'd planned. I looked at her, feeling numb, all my plans now carried out. All I could manage to say was, "So am I." As I felt my control starting to waver, I pulled off my wedding ring and let it fall to the floor in front of her. I kept my resolve and walked away quickly before my composure cracked, heading outside to find Harold. He stood waiting in the same spot, watching as the sheriff and Junior finished up their conversation. They both waved as they got into their car and drove off. Harold turned to me and asked, "Well, was that what you wanted?" I met his gaze and replied, "Yes. But I didn't enjoy a bit of it." He didn't look surprised. With a firm hand on my shoulder, he gave a slight nod and then headed off to his Camaro, disappearing down the road. Less than a month later, Paul and Melissa put their house on the market. The day before the movers arrived, Paul stopped by to talk. I stepped outside, and we stood there watching as Melissa directed the movers. He hesitated, then said, "I know it was you who sent me that envelope. Was there more to it?" He wasn't looking directly at me, but I knew he was waiting for an answer. Recalling Harold's advice, I glanced at Melissa, who happened to catch my eye. She quickly looked away, unable to hold my gaze. I turned back to Paul and said, "Yes, there was more, but I won't give it to you. You have to decide what you want to do. Someone once told me that if this is all you know, your marriage still has a chance." Paul gave a small nod, then walked away without another word. I never saw or spoke to either of them again. Dan Keller was eventually indicted and convicted of grand theft. Since he refused to admit any guilt, the court sentenced him to 10 years. He's been in prison for about a month now and still claims he had no idea how the stolen goods ended up in his truck. 6 months later, I received the final divorce papers. They arrived on a Thursday, ironically the same night Linda and Melissa used to have their girls' nights out. It was a simple set of documents, just stating that the marriage was dissolved, assets were equitably divided, and we would share custody of the kids. And that was it, one part of my life officially over. I sat in my office, staring at the papers, and thought about the finality of it all, how 15 years of marriage ended so unceremoniously. Linda had moved into a small apartment across town and had been seeing the kids every weekend until we finalized custody. With the divorce complete, we agreed that I'd have them for the summer, and she'd have them during the school year. To keep things simpler for the kids, I took over Linda's apartment, and she moved back into the house with them. Walker was in third grade by now, and Jake had just started preschool. My mom stayed with me during the summer to help with the kids, and she even offered to help Linda whenever she needed it. I never asked who else Linda had for support. Linda and I talked occasionally, doing our best to avoid discussing the past. She tried explaining things to me a few times, but I'd get angry, so she eventually stopped. She had wanted to talk before the divorce was finalized, but I refused, knowing it would be too easy to break down and too hard to let her go if I allowed it. Marriage is built on trust and commitment, and Linda had shattered that trust. Even though the love I had for her remained, I knew I couldn't stay. Nothing could change the fact that I still loved her. Somehow, unconditional love was a part of me, whether I wanted it or not. So, I made an effort to keep my distance, seeing her only when necessary. When I look back on the years we shared, I try to focus on the good moments, which is easier when I'm with the kids. They embody all that was pure and good in our marriage, and I try not to dwell on anything else. I also remember the advice from Harold Bowen, the man who told me that by choosing this path, I'd lose any chance to save my marriage. I still wonder why I went down this road. What if I had confronted her directly? What if I had forced her to make a choice? Would she have chosen me, chosen our family? Even if she had, would that have changed anything? Or would I still question her every move, wondering if history would repeat itself? Every night, as I come home alone, one question remains on my mind: now that I got exactly what I wanted, why am I not at peace? In the end, consequences are hard for both sides.